The house stood like a symbol of his years of struggle, every brick paid for with sweat, every corner polished with care. The walls filled with memories of nights spent working late and mornings filled with quiet hope. It was not a mansion, but to him it was a castle, his safe place, his dream made real. He lived peacefully there, waking each day to the sound of birds outside his window, watering the plants he had grown with his own hands, sipping tea while watching the sunrise, and feeling calm he had worked for all his life. Neighbors often glanced with envy because he had managed to build what many of them only dreamed of, a home free of debt, filled with pride. But behind those glances hid jealousy, whispers that grew sharper every day, whispers that turned into plots. And while he lived his life believing peace was permanent, others in the shadows were already planning his ruin. Then came the night that tore his world apart. It began quietly, the sky heavy with stars, the streets silent. He had fallen asleep in his bed, tired from another long day, when suddenly his nose caught the sharp smell of smoke. At first he thought it was a dream, a faint trace of burning wood mixing with his sleep. But then he opened his eyes and saw the orange glow flickering against his bedroom wall. His heart pounded, he jumped to his feet, and within seconds he realized the horror. His house was on fire, flames licked the hallway. The crackle of burning wood roared in his ears. Smoke filled his lungs, making him cough violently. He rushed to the door, but heat pushed him back like a wall of death. Every second counted as the fire spread faster than he thought possible. His mind spun with panic, yet his body moved on instinct. He grabbed a wet towel, covered his mouth, and searched for another way out. Windows shattered from the heat. Sparks flew into the night. He stumbled through the choking smoke, eyes burning, skin stinging. His hands reached blindly for escape, and finally he found it, bursting through the back door into the cold night air just as part of the roof caved in with a thunderous crash. The flames roared higher, consuming everything he had built. Neighbors poured out of their homes, some gasping, some pretending to help, but most just standing there watching the fire eat his dream alive. He fell to his knees, coughing, his chest heaving, staring in disbelief as his house burned to ashes in front of him. Fire trucks arrived late, hoses spraying, but too weak to stop the inferno, and within an hour nothing remained but charred ruins, black smoke rising into the dark sky like a cruel reminder that his years of struggle had been destroyed in a single night. At first he thought maybe it was an accident, maybe faulty wiring or a spark from somewhere. But the investigation revealed something darker, something that turned his grief into rage. The fire chief told him quietly that traces of accelerants had been found, the kind used to spread flames quickly. It was no accident. Someone had set the fire on purpose, and deep inside he already knew who. Jealous rivals who had envied his success for years. People who smiled to his face but whispered behind his back. They had finally acted, crushing him in the most brutal way. Rumors spread through the town faster than the fire itself. Some said he had staged it for money. Others claimed it was punishment for arrogance. Neighbors gossiped loudly, mocking his loss, laughing that the man who once walked proudly now had nothing but ashes. Their words cut deeper than the flames ever could, and he stood there day after day staring at the ruins, the smell of smoke clinging to his clothes, the image of his burning home replaying in his nightmares, his hands trembling with helplessness, his heart heavy with humiliation. He had lost not just wood and stone but memories, photographs, the table he had built by hand, the chair his father once used. Everything turned into black dust. Yet, even as he stood broken, something inside him refused to die. Beneath the ashes of his home a seed of revenge began to grow, small but unshakable. A fire deeper than the one that destroyed his walls. He stopped crying and started thinking. He stopped asking why and started planning. Because he understood one truth. They thought they had burned his dream. But all they had done was light a flame inside him that would not stop until their entire fortune went up in smoke. He walked away from the ruins that night with empty hands but eyes burning with a silent promise that this humiliation would not be his end. It would be the beginning of their downfall. And though the crowd still whispered and laughed, he heard none of it. His mind already shaping a plan, his heart already sharpening with purpose. And in that darkness where his house once stood, he found not defeat but the birth of a revenge that would one day turn their laughter into screams. After the fire reduced his house to nothing but ashes and black smoke, his life collapsed into a storm of struggle. He had no roof over his head, no furniture, no clothes except the ones he escaped with. He carried only the weight of humiliation, the whispers of neighbors, and the bitterness of loss. He rented a small room at the edge of town. a damp place with peeling paint and broken windows where the cold wind crept in at night. He lay awake staring at the ceiling, hearing the laughter of those who mocked him replay in his head. During the day he wandered the streets, his pockets almost empty, looking for work, taking any small job he could find, washing cars, unloading trucks, sweeping store floors. His hands blistered and his back ached. But every coin he earned he saved carefully because he knew his story was not over. Still the gossip followed him everywhere. People shook their heads, saying he had gone from proud homeowner to beggar. Some even joked that the fire was his punishment, and the rivals who had caused his ruin walked freely, boasting about their success, living in luxury, celebrating at parties, their smiles cutting him like knives. But he endured in silence. He endured the hunger of nights when he could not afford food. He endured the sting of shame when landlords looked at him with disgust. He endured the loneliness of having no one to call, because he had already chosen not to waste energy on despair. Instead, he sharpened it into focus. Each night after his exhausting work he sat at a small desk in his rented room with papers spread across the surface, old files, legal documents, public records. He searched for connections, tracing the steps of his rivals, studying how they built their fortune. He found debts hidden behind polished walls, court cases quietly settled, contracts filled with lies. He discovered their empire was not made of stone but of fragile glass. And the more he studied, the more he realized that they had built everything on fraud. He collected evidence, writing notes, filling folders with secrets, and every piece of information became another weapon for the future. Though the world saw only a broken man, inside he was preparing like a soldier waiting for the right time. Yet the struggle was heavy. There were days he thought of giving up, mornings when his body refused to rise, moments when the fire's memory dragged him into despair. But then he remembered the night flames swallowed his home. He remembered the smirk on the faces of those who had wanted him destroyed, and he clenched his fists, vowing again that his pain would not end in ashes. He walked past his old street sometimes, standing far away, watching his rivals' houses glowing with light, their cars parked proudly in driveways, their laughter spilling into the night, and though his chest burned with anger he smiled quietly, because he knew their celebration would not last forever. The higher they climbed, the harder they would fall, and he would be the one to make sure of it. His struggle was not weakness, it was training. Every insult, every rumor, every sleepless night was shaping him into something harder, something unstoppable, and though no one else could see it, in the ashes of his defeat he was already building the fire of their destruction. The more he struggled, the sharper his mind became. He realized that crying over the ashes of his burned house would not rebuild his life. Instead he had to strike back. But not with fists or fire, with something stronger, with hidden weapons that no one could see until it was too late. He began working silently, keeping his head down in public, acting like a man still broken, so his rivals would not notice him. But behind closed doors, he was different. His nights were filled with planning, his hands turning every piece of information he collected into a tool of war. He learned about their businesses, how they used fake companies to cover their wealth, how they bribed officials to stay untouchable, how they crushed anyone who stood against them, and instead of fearing their power he studied it. Memorizing every weakness, every crack in their empire, he reached out to people they had betrayed before, old partners left in ruins, workers cheated out of wages, families hurt by their greed. Slowly he built a small circle of allies, people who had nothing to lose and everything to gain from revenge. Together they shared documents, stories, and secrets. Each file he gathered became another weapon stored away, waiting for the day he would use it. At the same time he worked small jobs and invested carefully, buying shares quietly, putting money into businesses that his rivals ignored, creating networks that connected him to lawyers, bankers, and officials, all without ever revealing his true purpose. To the world he was still a man living in a small rental, eating cheap meals, wearing old clothes. But in reality he was building an invisible empire. One coin, one paper, one contact at a time, and every time his rivals laughed in their mansions or drove their expensive cars past him he only lowered his eyes and pretended to be weak, but inside he smiled, because he knew they were already bleeding, their fortune, already leaning on walls that he was secretly breaking apart. His hidden weapons grew sharper when he discovered financial fraud they had buried. He kept copies, stored them safely, making sure if they ever tried to crush him again he could burn their name in front of the whole world. He used patience as his shield, silence as his sword, moving slowly but never stopping, and the more invisible he became the more dangerous he was. His rivals thought the fire had ended him, but the truth was that the fire had forged him, turned him from a victim into a hunter, and his weapons were not guns or flames but knowledge, patience, and the kind of anger that never dies. And though they still celebrated their stolen success, he knew the day was coming when he would open his hands and unleash everything he had built. And on that day their fortune would go up in flames just like his house once did. His rivals believed they had erased him from existence. They walked proudly through the city as if untouchable, throwing parties, shaking hands with officials, signing deals worth millions, all while mocking the man whose house they had burned. But what they did not know was that he was already inside their walls, creeping quietly like a shadow, planting roots where they could not see, using patience like poison slowly spreading through their empire. He started by investing in small companies connected to their supply chains, businesses they thought were beneath them. But those companies gave him access to documents, records, and insider knowledge. He learned which banks handled their transactions, which suppliers were overcharging them, which employees hated them, and he began to tighten his grip in silence. He paid debts for people they had crushed, and in return those people fed him information. He hired workers they had fired unfairly, and those workers told him everything about their dirty tricks. Little by little their own world turned against them. Yet on the surface he still looked like a broken man. He still rented the same small apartment, still walked the streets with his head lowered, even greeting them politely when they passed him, making them believe he was harmless, and that arrogance was his greatest weapon. Because while they laughed at him in public meetings, in secret their contracts, their foundations, their money began to slip into his hands. He used false names and shell companies to buy into their projects. Soon half of their new ventures had his hidden signature behind them, and they never realized it. He would sit quietly in a corner at auctions, bidding calmly, and they never noticed that the man they thought destroyed was stealing their land, their property, their influence piece by piece. Their empire was like a giant ship with golden sails, but underneath the water holes were opening, leaks spreading, and he was the one holding the knife, cutting slowly, carefully, making sure the ship would sink when they least expected it. He watched them smile in photographs, shaking hands with politicians, but he also watched the numbers on his papers, numbers that told the truth, their debts growing, their investors nervous, their workers restless, and he knew the day was close, the day when the silence would break. Yet he waited, because revenge was not about speed, it was about timing, and the perfect moment had not yet come. So he stayed in the shadows, feeding their arrogance, letting them believe he was nothing, while in reality he was already the master of the game, his infiltration complete, his presence invisible, his trap set, and when the time came to pull the rope, they would not even understand how the man they once burned had managed to set their fortune on fire from within. The day of silence finally ended when he decided it was time to strike. For months he had planted seeds inside their empire, for months he had gathered evidence, built alliances, bought shares, and pulled strings. Now the web was so tight that one tug would bring the whole structure crashing down. He walked through the city streets like an invisible soldier carrying weapons no one could see, and while his rivals celebrated their supposed success with expensive parties and public shows of wealth, he released the first spark. Documents exposing their fraud were leaked to the press. Reporters rushed to cover the scandal. Headlines screamed about stolen money, false contracts, and illegal schemes. Their shiny reputation began to crack. But he did not stop there. At the same time he triggered withdrawals from investors who were secretly working with him. Money bled out of their accounts like water through a broken dam. Suppliers suddenly cancelled contracts because he had already bought them out. And workers they had abused now stood against them in protest. One by one their pillars of power fell. Yet they still tried to smile in front of cameras, still tried to laugh in boardrooms, until the government launched investigations and froze their assets. Their phones rang endlessly with angry partners demanding answers. Their once loyal friends began to distance themselves, and the rivals who had burned his home now sat in their offices surrounded by smoke of their own making. The man they mocked was no longer outside their walls. He was the fire consuming them from within, and he enjoyed watching their fortune go up in flames without ever lighting a match. Their mansions were raided, their luxury cars seized, their names dragged through the mud, and every headline, every angry shout from the public felt like justice carved into stone. He stood one evening outside their tallest office building, the place they had once boasted about as their crown jewel, and as police sealed the gates and reporters shouted questions, He felt the same cold wind he had felt the night his house burned. But this time it did not break him. This time it carried the sweet smell of revenge. They had taken his home and laughed at his ashes. But now he had taken their fortune, their pride, their empire, and left them with nothing, their faces pale and broken as they were escorted out under flashing cameras. No longer kings of the city but beggars of mercy. And he watched calmly, no anger, no shouting, just the satisfaction of knowing his plan had worked. The flames of revenge had done what real fire could never do. It had burned their very name into dust, and while they stared at him with hatred and disbelief, he only whispered to himself that this was only the beginning of the end, because once the fire starts, nothing can stop it until everything is reduced to ashes. The empire of his rivals had collapsed into dust, their wealth stripped away, their mansions empty, their cars seized, their names dragged through mud and spit. But for him the true victory was not just watching them lose everything. It was standing strong again after they had tried to bury him. He walked once more to the land where his house had once stood, the place that had turned into ashes on the night of betrayal, and now he stood there not as a broken man but as the owner of everything around it. He had bought back the land silently while destroying their fortune. He had reclaimed the soil where his dreams were first burned, and construction crews now worked under his command, building a new home, bigger, stronger, grander than before, every brick rising like a symbol of his revenge. Neighbors who once mocked him now greeted him with respect, their voices careful, their eyes filled with guilt. Some tried to apologize, some begged for his forgiveness, but he only gave them silence, for forgiveness was not his victory. His victory was their memory of what they had done and their shame of seeing him rise higher than they ever imagined. He did not need their words, he only needed their silence when he passed by. His rivals, once so arrogant, now lived in hiding, afraid to show their faces, their children taunted at schools, their names blacklisted, and he smiled coldly when he read about them in newspapers, broken and begging for help, because he knew no one would help them, not after their empire had been exposed as a rotten fraud. He had destroyed not just their wealth but their legacy, turning their proud name into a curse. One evening as the sun set he stood in front of his new house, taller and stronger, its windows glowing with light, its walls built not only from bricks but from the fire of his will. He looked around at the streets, at the people who now looked at him as a man untouchable, and he felt the weight of his journey, from peace to betrayal, from ashes to revenge, and finally to victory. And in that moment he whispered to himself that they thought they had ended him when they burned his house. But all they had done was light the fire that destroyed them. His story was not of defeat but of rebirth. His fall had become his rise, and his humiliation had become his weapon. Now he stood not just as a man with a home but as the master of their downfall, and while the world moved on, his rivals hiding in shame, his neighbors living under his shadow, his victory remained carved in every brick of his new home. A reminder that fire cannot destroy a man who turns flames into fuel. And as he closed the door behind him that night he knew the war was over, he had won completely, and his revenge was final.